I call Gareth Hughes.
Speaking of making you kia koutou kia ora, I just want to say, after 9 long years of voting against all the terrible national legislation in tertiary education, from reducing access to education, increasing the amount of money people were spending on their student loans, when National removed people aged over 55 from accessing the student allowance. In fact, Mr Speaker, I used to carry around a giant list of all the negative changes where National had made studying less affordable, less accessible, and in some cases downright impossible for thousands of students. So boy, it's great to be in this chamber tonight voting for positive tertiary education that's going to make it more affordable, more accessible, see more people educated. It's a wonderful thing. Now, I heard the last member say this was an ideological piece of legislation. This is simply unwinding National's ideological legislation. This original bill, as introduced by National, was to protect private interests, private profit in the tertiary education space. Previous governments of both Hughes had made sure there was a differential in the funding between public and private for-profit providers. What National wanted to do in their ideological bill was to lock future governments into giving what they called equality, which in fact was paying extra for private profit in the tertiary education space. I'm proud to be voting for good tertiary education. I'm proud of all those hundreds of thousands of Kiwis who voted to change the government because they wanted to see more progressive policy. They wanted to see smarter, evidence-based policy. They didn't want to see the taxpayer ripped off, which is what would have happened under National's existing legislation, would have locked future governments in. I also want to acknowledge the fantastic work of the Tertiary Education Union and the thousands of academics who turned up to the Select Committee, who protested, who wrote letters, signed things online, did all they could to protect their public education system. Now, this is one of the great taongas of our history, that we do have a wonderful tertiary education system, and we inherit the system built by previous generations. The way National had introduced the bill would have eroded that for private profit. That was the ideological position taken, not this side. So look, we're really proud to be voting for this legislation because it fundamentally changes the Education, Tertiary Education and Other Matters Amendment Bill as originally introduced under the Honourable Paul Goldsmith. Now, when we're talking about the ideological nature of legislation, let's also not forget how they were trying to change the framing and language. What we know is that has an incredible part of the political discourse is how you name and the words you use in the discourse. So what they tried to do was change private tertiary establishments to independent tertiary establishments, trying to actually remove the fact that these were private companies for profit. Now look, I don't want to come across that I'm giving them a bad rap. They do some tremendous work in our communities, private providers, but it's not the same as a public education system, and this is why I was standing with the TEU. Our public education system must be protected, because what we would have quite simply seen is an erosion of public standards. You would have seen cherry-picking of the most high-value, low-cost courses. In fact, what you had seen over the last 9 years were, in fact, polytechs were underfunded. They had to outsource to private providers some of the courses. The private providers then, for limited rental, actually went back to those training institutes, the polytechs, and used their facilities and made a profit on top of it. So look, changing the language was all about the ideological nature to present them as independent, as not-for-profit. Now, I'll give the government credit because while language matters, they have managed to refine some of the terminology in the sector. So now we're introducing a new subtype of private training establishment, which is a community tertiary education provider. Look, we shouldn't be seeing games with language for political point scoring. We should make sure that language, in fact, reflects what truly is occurring. And calling something a community tertiary education provider when it's a non-profit private provider is an entirely reasonable and accurate description. This is simply what the legislation does, introduces accurate terms. So look, Mr Speaker, I won't talk for long, but after 9 long years of an erosion of our tertiary education sector, of this ideological policies which have made it harder to study, harder for our academics, significantly underfunded, it's great to be able to reverse some of those changes. This is an entirely reasonable step to make sure that that existing and previous funding differential which previous governments had enumerated was simply because the taxpayer shouldn't be subsidising the capital asset base of private providers. Now, there is a role for the state to be providing a subsidy for education if a private provider is using it, but something National members never in the House, never in the Select Committee could answer is why the taxpayer should be providing that capital asset base for public providers, building future greater profits from. That's not the role of the taxpayer, to subsidise private providers' long-term profits. It was to subsidise the actual courses being provided because it was in the public interest. This is what I'm so proud to be part of a government with the Tertiary Education Minister, the Honourable Chris Hipkins, that's putting the public back in public education. It's a good day for New Zealand. Kia ora koutou, Mr Speaker.
I call Eric.